Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, NDC Policy Recommendations on Forests and Food, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am the Communications Specialist with the Forest and Climate team. And our presenters today are McKee from the NDC Partnership Support Unit, Fernanda de Carvalho from WWF, Franziska Haupt, and Haseeb Bakhtary, from Climate Focus. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. And for those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar. But yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. Next slide, please. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. And it's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you are always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message either via the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll try to get you sorted out as quickly as possible. On that note, questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat. I don't want to lose your questions there. We will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources, including some that are specific to this session, as well as a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of this session anytime you want to revisit it. So thank you all again for joining us. And with that, we'll get started. Amanda, I believe you are up first. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Amanda McKee, and I work with the NDC Partnership Support Unit. We are a coalition of governments and organizations working directly with national governments, international institutions, civil society, researchers, and the private sector to fast-track climate and development action. Our support focuses mostly on the implementation of NDCs, so working directly with national governments to help them to ensure that their NDCs are turned into concrete action. But this past year, we've scaled up our support for countries to really provide them with support as they update and submit enhanced and more ambitious NDCs. So I wanted to start by just providing a little bit of context before I talk about some of the support that we're providing and how that's translating into update NDCs and some of the trends that we're seeing. Really, the first generation of NDCs that were submitted in 2015 were often prepared in a rush, incorporating some of the immediately obvious emission reduction opportunities. So opportunities from sectors like energy or agriculture. 2020 is an important date because it really represents the first opportunities, the first requirement for countries to raise their ambition and to go beyond these quick wins that they had looked at previously and broaden the scope of their NDC. So this includes opportunities to add new sectors, to expand the scope of the NDC to cover new gases, to look closely at key vulnerabilities or adaptation actions. So there's a lot of opportunities that exist for countries to enhance their NDCs and to raise their ambition. I won't touch on this in the presentation, but just a quick note in terms of timing, COVID-19 has really had an impact on this progress. This is something that we've seen with the countries that we're supporting. It's delayed the process and it's made certain types of activities more difficult. So stakeholder consultations, for instance, activities that require people coming together in person. But the good news, and this is why I won't go into this in too much detail, but the good news is that we are still seeing countries really drive the NDC update process forward. They are still committed, even in light of the challenges that they're facing, responding to COVID, to ensure that they are coming forward with enhanced and ultimately more ambitious NDCs this year. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, in response to all of the expressed country needs that we've seen, the types of support that countries need to update their NDC, the NDC Partnership last year launched an initiative called the Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP for short. We launched this to really deliver targeted fast-track support to enhance countries' NDCs, including by raising ambition as part of this Paris Agreement NDC update process. In total, we are supporting 63 countries through CAP, and these countries are mostly NDCs. They represent 16% of global emissions, 23% of global population. And this support is actually being provided directly through our partners. So we have 46 partners who are providing this technical or financial support to countries. The range of support that's being provided is really immense. It's very broad. We have close to 800 different activities that are being supported across these countries, representing a lot of very detailed and specific needs that countries have. So touching on different sectors, the different specializations that our partners are able to bring to the table. Finally, CAP is combining not just the technical, but also the financial resources from partnership members, which is really allowing us to create this collective impact and synergies through these bold collaborative efforts. So in total, CAP is mobilizing close to $46 million. This funding is coming either directly from our implementing partners, as well as through a technical assistance fund that we're running for this purpose. Next slide, please. So if we look at the types of support that countries are requesting through CAP, we can tell a little bit about how they're approaching their NDC update. So the one caveat that I want to mention up front is that CAP, the support that we're providing through CAP, doesn't represent everything that the country is doing on their NDC, but at least gives us a little bit of a snapshot into the types of activities that countries are focusing on. And so if we look at these types of support, we can see how countries are intending to update their NDC over the coming months. And specifically, there are 3 types of support that we observe that are leading to enhanced NDCs. So this is first support to actually raise climate ambition in the country. The second type of support that we're seeing is support to actually increase the quality of the NDC. And the third type of support is support to strengthen the underlying processes or the processes related to the update of the NDC. And I'll go into all of these in a little bit. But what we see through the support that our partners are providing through CAP is that support is actually being provided across all of these enhancement pillars. So 84% of the countries that are receiving support through CAP are cutting across all 3 of those buckets that I outlined. So both quality, ambition, and process. The other 16% are receiving support in at least 2 of the 3 pillars. And so this comprehensive approach to preparing updated NDCs by countries has really demonstrated the importance of establishing a strong foundation to unlock ambition. And so countries are not just looking at ways that they can raise their targets, but they're looking at ways that they can raise their targets with strong underlying data, with clear implementation plans, with the inclusion of different sectors, different actors across society who will be responsible and affected by these targets. So that's what I mean when I say that the countries are really taking this comprehensive approach, ultimately laying the ground so that these ambitious NDCs are ultimately implementable. If we look at each of those 3 buckets that I outlined, all CAP countries, so 100%, are receiving some sort of support that's directly linked to efforts to increase the quality of their NDCs. So this includes things like developing methodologically and analytically robust targets. Nearly all countries, 98%, are receiving support to strengthen the associated processes. So this can include things like enabling greater ownership of the NDC revision process by building capacities that lead to revision activities, ensuring more national stakeholders are part of the process. And 86% are receiving support directly linked to efforts to increase ambition. And so this is about developing robust targets, strengthening the emission reduction target, setting sector-specific targets, adding adaptation targets. Next slide, please. So if we break these various buckets down, we can actually look at the intended outcomes even further and see exactly how countries are planning to enhance their NDC. So on this screen, the blue hexagons are showing those types of activities related to ambition, the yellow are related to quality, and the green are related to the process. If we look at overall, the biggest buckets there are really focused on delivering more well-informed, robust, inclusive targets, as well as efforts that are focused on long-term capacity building. And I'll come to that in just a moment. But in terms of efforts to increase ambition, countries are really focused on adding and expanding mitigation and adaptation targets. If we look at efforts to improve quality, these efforts are focused really on the implementability of the NDC. So countries are ensuring that targets are well informed, that they're realistic, that they're credible, but also that there are clear pathways for their implementation. So looking at the NDC as a living document. And countries are also looking at ways to make sure that the process is more inclusive, including the right stakeholders in national decision-making process, and actually engaging stakeholders in target setting as well. So the last thing I want to note here is that this focus on quality and strong process is especially important. So while most of the international discourse has rightfully been focused on raising ambition as the most important way for us to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, what we're actually seeing is that a lot of countries are receiving critical support to actually build up the national capacity to enhance their NDCs. To make them more inclusive, to improve the monitoring and reporting that goes along with that. And this is really helping to rectify some of the challenges that we saw in the first generation of NDCs, helping to reduce this dependency on fly-in, fly-out consultants who largely supported that first generation of NDCs, and allowing for more sustained country ownership of the NDC going forward. Next slide, please. So as I wrap up, I just wanted to give a few examples of how CAP support is looking at food and forest. So this is one of the things that we're seeing in terms of kind of expanding the coverage of the NDC to look into different areas. I mentioned at the outset that countries are looking beyond kind of typical energy, agriculture sectors and looking for new opportunities. So just a few examples I wanted to share to illustrate. In Ecuador, we're working with the Nature Conservancy, and one of the country requests that they're responding to is to support the country in developing methodologies to undertake climate risk assessments in the natural heritage adaptation sector. And this includes a number of sectors, but includes food sovereignty, agriculture, livestock, aquaculture, and fisheries. In Papua New Guinea, the Global Green Growth Institute through CAP is supporting the update of their MRV system for REDD and improving some of the functions around that. In Ethiopia, this is a typo for me on the slide, but this is the World Bank who is supporting this. And they are supporting a cost-benefit analysis of selected options in the forestry sector and looking at renewable energy generation and how different initiatives from the private sector feed into that. So again, really looking at that implementation angle of it. And the last example I wanted to share, in Pakistan, we have FAO, who's supporting the government monitoring the impacts of forestry projects. Next slide, please. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is just a quick update on what the current status of NDC submissions are. So if we look just exclusively at the 63 countries that we're supporting through CAP, so far we see 6 countries who've already submitted their 2020 NDC, so an updated or a new NDC. The positive thing that we've seen is that quite a few countries are still intending to submit before the end of the year. We have about 28 countries that have communicated to us that they plan to submit. And the majority of those who aren't submitting, so about 20, plan to submit by June of 2021. So we are definitely seeing delays in the submission process, but by COP26, we do anticipate that there will be a really strong and really robust set of new updated NDCs coming forward. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And so I think next I will turn it to Fernanda.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are in the world. Morning here in Brazil. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today talking about NDCs, mainly for two reasons. One of them is we know that under the Paris Agreement, everyone was expecting the NDCs, the second round of NDCs, to be submitted before COP26 in 2020, and COP26 was postponed to 2021. So, and NDCs are very, very important to keep the Paris Agreement alive. They are actually the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement. And the second reason is, for the NDCs submitted so far, we know we are not even close to where we need to be. We need much more from countries. So it's a good discussion that we're going to have today. Slide, please. Oh, sorry. Back to that one, sorry. I was confused. Yeah, so the work that WWF is doing now, as I already mentioned, NDCs are the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement, and alignment to 1.5, of course, is the cherry on top of the cake, is what everybody wants to see. But there are also other features and policies that are important for NDC implementation, and that's what the checklist that I'm going to present to you today focuses on. It also aims at setting a clear and constructive benchmark for incremental progress. And as I mentioned before, some elements that are important for NDCs are processes, structural elements, and enabling conditions that will lay the proper foundations for an effective long-term response. I think the NDC Partnership is also working with this when they talk about quality and processes. And we want to continue the conversations with governments. We are present in about 100 countries, and we want to have we want to enable our offices with a specific analysis that will allow them to work with their governments in improving their NDCs. Next, please. So this is our checklist. We are rating NDCs. From the NDC we want, then we have NDCs that have a short way to go, some way to go, and NDCs we don't want. And our checklist has 5 areas and 20 criteria. And the 5 areas there are ambition, fostering systemic change, inclusiveness and participation, also contribution to sustainable development, and measuring, reporting, and verifying. So under ambition, we are looking at mitigation, strengthen targets. We want economy-wide targets. Also, carbon budgets aligned to 1.5. And of course, we are not doing the analysis work for that. We build on the work of others, such as the Climate Action Tracker that has been doing that for 10 years. We want also that the targets are aligned with a 2050 or earlier net zero long-term strategy. It is a great movement that we have seen recently by China to announce a net zero target, followed by Japan, Korea, the EU. So we think this is positive and this can change the game, but this needs to be backed up by short-term and mid-term plans. So these targets need to be reflected in the NDCs. Adaptation with clear adaptation objectives, finance with quantitative finance, also clear conditional targets, moving from conditional to unconditional targets. On fostering systemic change, we are looking at including more sectors and setting targets for sectors that didn't have targets. We are also looking at just transition policies. It's super important that the workforce and other vulnerable people have policies to give them a net support, a supporting net. And under inclusiveness and participation, we are looking at processes, the processes for designing and implementing the NDCs, because if we want NDCs to be the social pacts we want them to be, they need the engagement of all stakeholders at all levels. So those processes will be very important. And also the contribution to sustainable development. we are looking at linkages with the SDGs and measurable nature-based solutions. And the last one that we are looking at measuring, reporting, and verifying is whether countries have transparent national systems for reporting progress or plans in place for such systems. And according to a qualitative analysis of all those criteria, we're looking at the NDCs and we are rating them. Next slide, please. So those are the countries we looked at. We consider that so far 17 NDCs have been submitted, and those are the countries who have submitted NDCs. Japan, we highlight there in red because they have resubmitted their 2015 NDC. Ecuador, you see it in some websites and not in the formal website of the UNFCCC. Because what happened in Ecuador is that they presented an INDC in 2015, but since they only ratified the Paris Agreement in 2017, their 2019 NDC is considered their first NDC. So we won't see an enhanced NDC from them as their NDC is quite recent. And actually they are a front runner in the sense that they are already complying with the Katowice COP guidelines for NDCs. So we consider Ecuador NDC as well. And Switzerland and New Zealand, although formally they submitted NDCs, what they are doing is that they are communicating on national processes to get to an NDC or to get to a net zero target. It's not a proper NDC. Under analysis, we have the most recent ones, Cuba, Vietnam, Mongolia, and Thailand. I think Cuba and Vietnam will be in our website today. So those are under analysis still. Next one, please. So this is the NDC meter that we have so far, and it doesn't include some of the countries I mentioned yet. But this is the results from this analysis. We have as NDCs we don't want the Japanese NDC because, as I mentioned, what they presented was their 2015 NDC, and New Zealand just because they made a communication on the process for getting to a net zero target maybe next year. So those are NDCs we don't want. NDCs that have some way to go are Norway and Singapore. Norway did enhance their target, but they didn't present one of the demands of civil society that was what amount they're going to do domestically. So we are considering Norway as an NDC that has some way to go. Singapore, because they didn't enhance their target, they just changed it from presenting it in an intensity target mode to an absolute target. And then as a short way to go, we have quite a few NDCs. We have Andorra, Chile, Ecuador, Jamaica, and the Marshall Islands. Chile is it's a pretty interesting NDCs with lessons from countries because they did incorporate lots of the input of civil society. We were discussing this in a previous event before, and they did the effort of putting out an NDC in the midst of a social crisis while still holding a COP in Madrid, and also in the context of COVID. And they are doing progress now in discussing their long-term strategies. So it's an interesting example. And the NDCs we had some countries that were really careful with processes and what they included in their NDC matches very well what we are asking for in our checklist. Unfortunately, those are small countries that don't have a big contribution in terms of emissions. So although we commend them for their goodwill and their progress and their fantastic work in enhancing their NDCs, we know that they are far, or we are far, or the world is far from where we needed to be related to NDCs, because the current NDCs, the NDCs that we had in 2015, there was a projection by the Climate Action Tracker that they will keep us on a trajectory to 2.5 degrees Celsius global warming. And of course, to stay in a 1.5 pathway, which is what everyone wants, and the objective of Paris Agreement, we need much more. And we need especially the big emitters, the countries that have emitted the most and hold the most resources, to take action and to come forward with enhanced NDCs. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to present to you some of the highlights of the work we have been doing in NDCs, I should have put the website here, but I will paste it in the chat for you to have a look at. Besides all the work that I presented of the analysis of countries, we'll have a map there. You can click in the arrows in the map and that will take you to a country. And then in the country, you'll find the information. You'll find 2 documents, which is a summary of the analysis with advances and gaps. And the second document is a detailed analysis with a table with each of the criterion of our checklist. And we were doing some work in trying to get the highlights of nature of each one of the criterion in NDCs. So I pulled the one on nature-based solutions here because I think that's what's relevant for the conversation today. And this is the kind of conclusions or trends that this qualitative analysis can present to you. So countries mentioned nature-based solutions in their NDCs, and we had a total of 11 countries out of 17 doing that, talking about nature-based solutions. But the ask in our checklist is for measurable nature-based solutions. So of these 11 countries, 8 countries present some kind of metrics or indicators connected to nature-based solutions and how they are going to assess emissions reductions regarding nature-based solutions. And measurable outcomes are usually connected to mitigation purposes. So when they talk about nature-based solutions for mitigation, and it's also interesting that the majority of countries, I think 8 of them are talking about mitigation and adaptation, and there are 3 that talk only about adaptation, then there's only 1 country that talks about mitigation. So those countries that are talking about mitigation purposes usually present some kind of measure, be it CO2 tons or percentage of forest cover that they will restore, or hectares or square kilometers, I don't know. All of those are connected to mitigation purposes. On the adaptation side, we see a strong gap on measurable nature-based solutions. One of the recommendations that we have in a publication that's similar to the ones that will be presented here, but focus at nature-based solutions, is that the number of people that benefit from an adaptation intervention could be a measure, but countries are not yet using that measure. It's a complicated one, I must admit, and it needs lots of capacity building. Also, what we see on NDCs is a strong focus on land and REDD Plus as the preferred nature-based solutions. There are some countries that mention oceans too. It's Suriname and Cuba, more from an adaptation resilience perspective. And also Chile. Chile has a plan for oceans. Oceans is one specific piece of their NDC. As I mentioned before, it's a very unique NDC. There is a strong connection of nature-based solutions to conditional targets. So financial flows, finance is still a need. Ecuador and Suriname make it very clear. So, so this is something also for us to consider. And the donor countries don't mention the amounts committed to nature-based solutions, which is a demand that we would like to see fleshed out in NDCs. They don't usually mention the amounts for international support, which would be already a big step, and even less what they are doing connected to specific demands. So this is the kind of analysis that our checklist with the qualitative analysis that we are doing can present to us. I think this is helpful for us to plan policies and to, as I mentioned before, to shape our work and our focus with specific countries. And I would also recommend that you take a look on the website, because there is a resource section where we present recommendations for specific sectors and issues, as the ones that will be presented here. We'll have the ones for food systems and forests presented next. And we also have some for loss and damage, others more specific for nature-based solutions. Stay tuned for cities and other sectors. So that's what I had to present to you today. And under this umbrella, it's great that we are working with partners that will now present the work that they did in partnership with us on food systems and forests. So over to Franziska and Haseeb from Climate Focus.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'll just provide, my name is Franziska, and I'll just provide a few introductory comments from Climate Focus and a bit of context on why this is so important. So it was mentioned earlier that COVID has delayed progress on revising the NDCs, but it's also a reminder of how urgent it is to act on climate change, because it shows our vulnerabilities in our economic and social systems. If we're not successful in mitigating climate change, we'll face more crises like this and probably even bigger crises. And so far, we haven't made a lot of progress. Emissions reached a new record high in 2019, and the recent decline because of COVID is probably short-lived. Fernanda said it already, much more needs to be done, and countries urgently need to increase their ambition and take steps towards implementing their targets. We will talk, Haseeb and I will talk about two essential nature-based solutions. One is tackling emissions in how we produce and consume food. Food systems, from growing plants to processing, to distribution, to final waste, accounts for up to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. It also includes emissions from deforestation for agricultural commodities. And the other essential part of the solution is in the forest sector. So avoiding forest loss in tropical forests already has a mitigation potential that is equivalent to almost 10% of the 2019 emissions. We need to address deforestation driven by food production, but also by other drivers such as mining, oil and gas extraction, infrastructure developments. There is an even larger mitigation opportunity if we consider forest restoration and improved forest management. So both these nature-based solutions, forest sector and food system mitigation opportunities, they can reduce emissions, but they also offer important synergies. They can help improve food security, promote more efficient production, reduce excessive exploitation of resources, and help us adopt more responsible consumption models. They also contribute to the protection of ecosystem services that millions of people in this world directly depend upon. Governments, companies, civil society around the world recognize this important role of food systems and forests and their sustainable use. This is reflected not only in the Paris Agreement, but also in the New York Declaration on Forests and the Sustainable Development Goals and various other pledges. We still have time to reach the Paris Agreement, but we've just learned, the progress assessment will come out tomorrow, that we failed to reach the first milestone of the New York Declaration on Forests. It was halving deforestation by 2020. We clearly failed on that, and we're not on track to meet the 2030 goal to stop natural forest loss by 2030. With that in mind, the NDCs and this revision process offers a great opportunity and framework for translating these high-level pledges, not just the Paris Agreement, into targets and actions. And this is not just for the climate, but for many other reasons. My colleague Haseeb will now provide an overview of two papers that offer recommendations and examples on how this can be done. With that, I hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Franziska. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who are listening to us today. So the first of these two papers that Franziska just referred to is Enhancing Forest Targets and Measures in NDCs. This paper basically provides an overview of the role and opportunities in the forest sector to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and provides a checklist of recommendations to enhance forest-related targets and measures in NDCs that are being revised, and provides additional resources where readers can go for further guidance on how they can improve their forest-related targets in the NDCs. And the third section, or the third chapter of this paper, provides a list of policy instruments and activities for policymakers to consider in their enhanced NDCs. These are grouped under different categories of policy instruments. Next slide, please. So, what opportunities actually exist in the forest sector? Franziska did mention overall the opportunity of both mitigation, adaptation, and other co-benefits that exist in forest and food systems to contribute to climate change mitigation and to achieve Paris Agreement goals. This paper presents 3 opportunities in the forest sector. These are reduced deforestation and forest degradation, improving forest management, including agroforestry practices, and afforestation, reforestation, and forest restoration. Together, these 3 opportunities could contribute almost 18% of the mitigation needed to reach that Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target by 2050. For example, measures to reduce deforestation and forest degradation could reduce emissions by up to 3.5 gigatons per year, and activities to enhance forest stocks such as deforestation, forest management, and agroforestry could sequester emissions of up to 4.6 gigatons per year. However, it is important to note that these estimates vary from studies to studies, and also these are global studies, and mitigation potential from these activities could vary from country to country. And they largely depend, among other factors, of course, on the availability of forests in each country and the current land use practices and suitable areas for restoration and afforestation interventions. In addition to the mitigation potential and opportunities, these interventions provide adaptation and other co-benefits that Franziska highlighted. I would just reiterate some of those, which include, for example, reducing the vulnerability of ecosystems to climate change impact, also limiting diseases and reducing healthcare costs, and also reducing the risks of floods and extreme weather and air pollution. However, these opportunities also involve costs and certain trade-offs, in particular, where the implementation is directly going to affect livelihoods of local communities and people, and also limiting opportunities for economic development. And the costs also for implementing these opportunities vary. However, most of these opportunities are very cost effective compared to emerging technologies such as the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Nonetheless, many countries will need financial support to implement these measures. Next slide, please. The paper also provides a checklist for enhancing forest-related targets and measures, and these recommendations are framed around the 5 enhancement areas that are included in the NDCs V1 framework that Fernanda presented earlier, and additional resources and sources for guidance on how each of these areas can be enhanced in the revised NDCs are provided in the paper. So the first area of enhancement, that's ambition. This includes increasing mitigation ambition and targets from forests, and also enhancing adaptation plans, improving these plans over time, enhancing finance commitments in the NDCs for forests, and also clarifying the sources of these finance that's needed for implementing NDCs. The second area of enhancement is fostering systemic change. This means including targets from other sectors that affect forests. These might be food consumption and diets that drive deforestation and forest degradation. It could also mean measures to address import of forest-rich commodities like palm oil or beef in consumer countries, as well as measures for other key structure sectors like forest governance and law enforcement, and policies for human rights protection and labor rights protection. The third area of enhancement is contribution to SDGs. Fernanda said that all NDCs must provide links to SDGs. in particular in the forest sector, several of the SDGs are going to be affected by measures taken in the sector for climate change mitigation adaptation. In the revised NDCs, it's important to clarify these linkages and also include information on potential synergies and unavoidable trade-offs between forests and other SDGs, and on how achieving the SDGs will impact forests and forest-related livelihoods, for example, and how this may in turn enhance or undermine the contribution of forests to achieving NDC targets. The fourth area of enhancement is improving inclusiveness and participation. Forest sector is connected to the food system as well as to other sectors in a country. Therefore, cross-sectoral coordination is essential for enhancing NDCs and to ensure that policies are planned by forest authorities as well as agencies regulating activities in sectors that influence forests and drive deforestation, such as agriculture, urban development, and mining and extractives and rural development. Such coordination supports coherence and synergies, not only between different sectors, but also in the creation of relevant institutions for implementation. The fifth area of enhancement is improving progress tracking. This means that many countries need to provide targets and also milestones to ensure that they can track the implementation of NDCs. Many countries already have established forest monitoring systems and capacities as part of the REDD+ readiness process, for example, to access REDD+ finance, and they can use these capacities to gather information that will allow the progress tracking of NDCs. Next slide, please. And the last section or chapter of this paper provides examples for policy instruments and activities that the policymakers could include in the NDCs. However, these recommendations are not exhaustive and they are not in a strict hierarchy. Instead, they highlight different categories of policy instruments and their potential outcome and examples of activities countries can implement. It should be noted that this should be adapted to meet the needs of each country, and the policymakers will need to prioritize activities and assess what are the most cost-effective depending on their specific situation. Next slide, please. For example, this table provides two instruments: regulation of conservation of forests, conversion of forests, and designation of protected areas as instruments that could mitigate and could contribute to mitigation adaptation from forest sector. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to move on to the next and the second paper that provides recommendations on including forest system in NDCs. This guidance paper provides an overview and of role and opportunities for food systems to contribute to climate change mitigation adaptation, as well as suggestions of policies and measures that could be included in NDCs for activities across the food system. It identifies 16 ways policymakers can take more action along the food supply chain. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. The mitigation potential of food system is widely recognized in literature. For example, Franziska did mention earlier that the IPCC special report on climate change and land estimates that food system, including the production, storage, transport, packaging, process, all the way to the retail and consumption, including food loss and food waste, are responsible for 21 to 37% of all GHG emissions every year. So the sector provides significant mitigation potential. Globally, production level measures like land use change and agriculture emissions could reduce overall emission by 7.2 gigatons, and consumption side measures such as shifting towards sustainable diets and reducing food loss and waste could reduce emissions by 1.8 gigatons per year. However, again, these measures and these potentials vary across countries and contexts, and different countries have different responsibilities and can take different measures to avail these opportunities. Next slide, please. Yes, the paper, similar to the previous one, provides a checklist of different measures that could be taken in different stages of the food system, including at the production level, as well as transportation, processing, and consumption level. Again, these measures are not exhaustive. These are just lists of recommendations that could be expanded depending on country context, and they need to be adapted also considering the local trade-offs and context. Next slide, please. The food systems paper provides 16 guiding questions. Under each guiding question, the paper also provides mitigation and adaptation measures in different stages of the food supply chain, food systems, and it also provides questions for policymakers to consider when including food system related measures in the NDCs. These guiding questions highlight categories of activities, areas, and broad examples for opportunities to enhance food system targets. And as I mentioned earlier, it needs to be adapted to meet the needs of the country context. Next slide, please. This slide provides an example of one of the guiding questions. This question is related to reducing food waste by consumer and retailers. So the question is, does a country have a high rate of food waste? If yes, then a list of various measures and activities are provided that countries can take in improving food system targets in the NDCs. Again, these tables provide also the emission impact, mitigation potential, adaptation impact on other co-benefits, and the linkages to various SDGs for each of these questions in the table. Next slide, please. And that's it. These are just some questions for the audience, how these resources can help them overcome some of the challenges they might have faced in including forest and food system related targets and measures in their NDCs, and what support is needed to include these targets and measures in their enhanced NDCs going forward. Next slide, please.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Haseeb, for rounding out our very excellent presentation. That was really interesting to listen to. Participants, this is your time. We've got about 12 minutes to answer your questions. So please feel free to send those through the Q&A function. They will get lost if you put them in the chat. Please use the Q&A. But if you wanted to answer any of Haseeb's questions from the previous slides, and actually, can we go back one? We can leave that slide up. Feel free to drop those answers here in the chat because we collect those answers, and Haseeb and Franziska can look at those answers as we wrap up the end of the webinar. So let's start off with our very first question, and I'm going to direct this one to Amanda, except I think she answered it already. Very clever. Well, the answer to that question is in the answer tabs. And so Ken, several of you, I believe, spoke to the particularities of implementing or assessing NDCs at the country level, because we can look at the big global picture of NDCs and the commitments that they entail, but really the real work happens at the country level and even further down in the implementation at the local level. But we can still talk about those big picture processes as well. And so Fernanda, perhaps you can start off. Can you give us an example of a really big challenge that countries face in the process as they revise their NDCs? and particularly if it speaks to a pattern that a lot of other countries are facing as well.
Well, yeah, I can name I can name a few. I think, of course, the COVID pandemic was a big challenge this year because it has affected countries' capacities to cope with other demands. Of course, countries had to direct resources, be them financial or human resources, to combating the pandemics. But I also think that one of the big challenges that we see from countries is regarding data collection, and that relates to capacity, really. So I think that the countries that have submitted NDCs so far are small countries, are developing countries, and providing good data is hard. So that's why in our checklist, we see that the tracking progress systems is one of the items that needs the most development by countries, if you like. There are some countries who mentioned they are taking steps, and they have the plans to put such systems in place, but that requires specific knowledge and data. So that's a gap that I would highlight. Over.
Thank you, Fernanda. Amanda, would you like to chime in with any examples that you have from your side?
Yeah, and I would really echo what Fernanda said in terms of data collection. I guess two additional challenges I wanted to highlight, and I think these are both extremely relevant in the context of COVID, and amplified through what we're seeing in terms of COVID. The first is actually around engagement of different stakeholders and engagement of different ministries in the process. So this is a really important part of the NDC process to ensure that the targets, everything that we're discussing about how different sectors will be reflected in the NDC are done appropriately. So ensuring not just that you have the right data, but that the targets are appropriate, that they're implementable, and that requires discussions with the right people. That can either be at the ministry level, it can be at the subnational level, it can be engaging different kind of private sector actors. And COVID has made this one element extremely difficult, obviously because of restrictions on actually having in-person meetings. So we're seeing a lot of innovative ways to have online virtual consultations, but this is definitely one challenge that we've seen. The other one I would say is really related to financing. And so obviously there's a pull in resources that are moving away from climate into economic recovery, and that's extremely concerning. But on the other hand, we do see a lot of governments who are taking more time to actually cost their NDC. And so in putting forward these different actions in the NDC, ensuring that they're costed, that there are appropriate processes within the national budget to budget resources. And this is all helpful as we move into the actual implementation stage as well. So making sure that those mechanisms and that information is in place so that international partners can more easily come forward and finance that support. So those were the two kind of big challenges that we see outstanding I wanted to share.
Thank you. I would like to ask Franziska and Haseeb this next question. We've got a couple of questions about diets and why there's a focus on food waste as opposed to diet in that NDC and food systems report that you presented on. Can you speak to a little bit why the focus would be on food waste as opposed to diets, or what are some of the difficulties in specifically addressing diet in the process of an NDC?
Sure, this is Haseeb. I can take this question. Actually, I don't think the food systems paper focuses on food waste and food loss specifically. It does include measures on transforming or shifting toward more sustainable diets to reduce emissions. So there are measures. However, both food waste and diets are currently absent from almost all of the NDCs as measures to contribute to the NDC targets. Particularly, the reason behind this is that the difficulty around shifting diets and around around basically accounting emissions from shifting diets to more sustainable consumption, as well as accounting for emissions from food waste and food loss. Yeah, Franziska, would you like to contribute to that? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think we cover it in the paper. We both cover it. The point is that the NDCs don't actually cover it yet.
Thank you. One of the elements of an NDC is that it's supposed to be cross-sectoral. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to how the NDC process can help bring together different sectors or different ministries of government with different interests in presenting and building this document. Fernanda, would you like to go first?
Yeah, as Amanda mentioned, the COVID pandemic halted the possibility of many countries of having in-person meetings. But I think, you know, those meetings, consultations are super important. And I think, you know, the key, how can I say, game changer for this is to have one, of course, political will. We need the political will of countries, and also climate governance structures. We have seen that countries that have commissions or committees involving various ministries along with academia and civil society and others can provide processes that will bring together sectors with different interests. I think that's the way to do it. It needs some investment, and I don't mean like only money investment, but some political investment from governments too. Over.
Thank you. I don't know if any other panelists would like to weigh in on that one.
I'd be happy to add just a couple of thoughts on that. I would completely echo everything that Fernanda has just said. I think at one level, this type of cross-ministerial mechanism can be very important for keeping that political will up and for creating the incentive for different ministries to engage in this process, which traditionally has been seen as something that the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Climate Change leads. And frankly, in a lot of countries, the Ministry of Environment isn't the most powerful ministry. And so having them reach out to you and request input might not be as well received if it's being backed by a ministerial committee or being backed at kind of the head of government level. So this can be really important to create that political will across government. It's also extremely important in terms of the implementation. So the NDC partnership, the way that we work, we actually have focal points both within the Ministry of Environment, but also within the Ministry of Finance and Planning. And so all of the discussions that we have in country around the implementation involve these two ministries to ensure that there is that cross-ministerial discussion taking place, and also ensuring that sectoral ministries are engaged at the appropriate stages. So just wanted to flag really from the conception of the NDC all the way through the implementation, this is an extremely important element.
Thank you so much. And it actually looks like we've come to the end of our time today, but we do have some pending questions in the chat, or in the Q&A function rather, that I will work with our presenters to see if we can get some short written answers pulled together. And we'll move to the next phase of our webinar. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And actually the second to next slide, since we skipped this one. Thank you. So thank you all so much for attending today. Thank you, Amanda, Fernanda, Franziska, and Haseeb for sharing your expertise with our community, and for the participants for joining and sending in your really thoughtful and engaging questions. You'll all receive a follow-up email in 24 hours with some additional questions that are specific to this webinar, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can find it, and all of the papers and websites that we mentioned here during this webinar. Next slide, please. And if you would like to revisit it, the recording should be up on our YouTube channel, hopefully by this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. You can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to the presenters for sharing with us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day and that you're all staying safe as possible. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.